Dawn no longer belonged to the sky. It belonged to speed. Germany, early 1945. At 400 miles per hour, the air turned against flesh. Inside the narrow cockpit of an FW-190, the control stick felt carved from stone, every inch a battle. Yet behind him, a Hawker Tempest rolled effortlessly, its 4 Hispano cannons closing in, steady and calm. What had just broken the barrier every pilot believed absolute? It wasn't a larger engine. It wasn't a new wing. It was a mechanism weighing less than 5 pounds, hidden at the trailing edge of its aileron, a thinking spring, automatically pushing back against the wind as the speed increased, keeping the stick as light at 250 as it was at 400. That night, many Luftwaffe pilots learned the truth too late. At the speed where the human body freezes, British engineering still moved freely. And from that moment on, the sky was no longer ruled by skill, but by technology. 18,000 feet above a fractured landscape, the air was thick with oil smoke and melted snow. Far below, the woods of the Rhineland burned in long black lines where Allied bombs had carved the winter soil. Inside a cramped Focke-Wulf 190D9, Oberleutnant Heinrich Roth shoved his control stick hard to the right. The airspeed indicator trembled past 400 miles an hour. His shoulders locked, every muscle screamed. The stick barely moved a centimeter. Behind him, a Hawker Tempest 5 rolled as if on strings, smooth, precise, unhurried. 4 Hispano cannons aligned like a compass needle closing on its mark. 3 seconds later, the German sky lit with the short, merciless flash of 20-millimeter fire. At the velocity where flesh surrenders, the difference between life and death came down to something smaller than a clenched fist, a spring. For most of the war, the Luftwaffe had believed it flew the finest fighters on Earth. The FW-190 and the Bf-109 were symbols of German precision, fast, powerful, reliable. Factory posters called them the ultimate expression of single-engine design. But above 350 miles per hour, the praise dissolved into physics. Air resistance rises with the square of speed. At 400 miles per hour, the forces on the ailerons nearly doubled those at 300. For the pilot, that meant 60 pounds of side pressure just to move the stick an inch, an act bordering on the impossible while pulling 6 Gs. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe squadrons were sending desperate field reports. Controls become immovable beyond 380 miles per hour. Even veterans like Priller and Steinmann admitted that their aircraft could dive fast, but not maneuver. The high-speed zone had turned into a dead corridor. Whoever entered first lost control first, and somewhere inside that corridor, the British had found a way to survive. Across the Channel, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, engineers called it the aileron heaviness crisis. After years of flying the Typhoon, pilots complained their arms cramped after minutes of combat. Sidney Cam, the mind behind the Hurricane, understood that air combat had outgrown human strength. The answer lay not in power, but in feel. In a small lab, aerodynamicist Leslie Frise pulled an old blueprint from 1935, spring tab aileron, experimental prototype. It was disarmingly simple, a tiny auxiliary surface on the trailing edge of each aileron connected through a coiled spring. As aerodynamic load increased, the spring compressed, forcing the tab to deflect in the opposite direction of the main surface. That deflection generated its own airflow pressure, helping move the main aileron. The faster the aircraft went, the more the spring helped. No hydraulics, no pumps, no extra weight. Just a few pounds of tempered steel, hand-assembled at Hawker's Langley plant, where young women checked each spring's compression with dial gauges precise to thousandths of an inch. By the summer of 1944, the first Tempest appeared over Normandy. German pilots reported a Spitfire twice as heavy, rolling twice as fast. Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed it as exaggeration. Then in September 1944, ace Joseph Priller met a Tempest over Belgium. He later wrote, "At 400 miles per hour, the stick felt buried in concrete, while the English fighter danced as if the air were liquid. Those duels were no longer contests of skill. They were demonstrations of physics. One side armed with a new equation, the other chained to the old." By November 1944, General Adolf Galland ordered an emergency inquiry. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf engineers were summoned to Rechlin Test Center. They examined reconnaissance photos, wreckage, and combat footage. The early consensus, the British must be using hydraulic boost. They were wrong. When a nearly intact Tempest was shot down near Rhine, a team led by Dr. Friedrich Zimmermann discovered an unfamiliar mechanism on the trailing edge of each wing. A small tab, a spring linkage, and the mark Hawker Aircraft Limited stamped in aluminum. Zimmermann's report read, "The enemy possesses a control system that reduces stick forces by 70% at combat speed. Such improvement was previously considered impossible." He added that to retrofit a similar device onto the FW-190 would require a complete redesign of the wing, impossible amid bombing raids and collapsing supply lines. By early 1945, the technological gap had become a strategic one. Air combat was no longer about who flew better, but who could still move the stick at 400 miles per hour. Tempest squadrons based in Holland and northern Germany destroyed over 200 enemy aircraft in 3 months, suffering minimal losses. In every report, pilots repeated the same phrase: "Controls remain light at 420 miles per hour." For the Luftwaffe, those 5 words meant death sentences delivered by mathematics. The spring tab didn't fire bullets, it didn't explode. It simply turned every British fighter into a predator that could hunt where others froze. The story of the spring tab was also the story of 2 engineering cultures. German designers pursued perfection, intricate, precise, heavy with innovation. British engineers pursued sufficiency, good enough to win. While Berlin poured resources into jets and rockets, Hawker's team quietly refined a spring and a hinge. And when the war's outcome was written, the victors' names were not only those of generals, but of toolmakers. From those modest tests emerged the concept of artificial feel, the ancestor of modern fly-by-wire control. What German engineers had declared unsolvable without hydraulics, British engineers had solved with tempered steel and pragmatism. On March 3, 1945, Pierre Clostermann lifted off from Vogel Air Base in his Tempest 5, carrying that 5-pound mechanism beneath his wings. At 18,000 feet, 2 FW-190 Dora fighters dove on him at a combined speed of 850 miles per hour. Clostermann pulled. The Tempest rolled with perfect grace, as if time itself slowed. In that instant, air combat changed forever. Technology, not muscle, now defined the limits of flight. Cold mist drifted across a cracked strip of concrete. 3 Tempests of number. 3 squadron touched down in sequence, engines coughing, wings streaked with oil and cordite smoke. When the Napier sabers wound down, the air fell into that uncanny silence that follows combat. In the lead cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann stared at the sky, thin white spirals marking where 2 German fighters had vanished moments before. He had just survived an 8-minute duel against 2 Focke-Wulf 190 Doras. They had dived from 20,000 feet at more than 800 miles an hour combined, numbers that should have made them untouchable. Yet when Clostermann rolled, the Tempest answered instantly. The German fighters tried to follow, their sticks locked solid. Within 2 turns, the sky of Germany had changed owners. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer the terror of Europe. Veteran pilots were gone, replaced by 19-year-olds with barely 50 flight hours. Fuel was rationed, runways were mud. Every takeoff felt like gambling with fate. But the odds had shifted deeper than they knew. The dice themselves had been loaded by physics. In the dying battles over the Ruhr, FW-190s and BF-109s could still climb fast. But once their airspeed passed 350 miles per hour, the controls hardened like stone. Pilots called it Steiner's arm. After 10 seconds of high-speed maneuvering, their forearms went numb. Meanwhile, the Tempest rolled freely, as if immune to the air's weight. On the charts at Farnborough, that advantage was just a note. Minus 73% control force reduction. In the skies above Germany, it meant survival. Inside the Luftwaffe's Rechlin test center, Dr. Friedrich Zimmermann laid his final report before General Adolf Galland. "There is no hydraulic system," he said. "It is purely mechanical, yet more effective than anything we conceived." Galland leaned over the schematic. A tiny tab, a spring linkage, a hinge. "A spring?" he asked. "Yes," Zimmermann replied. "And we cannot copy it quickly. It would mean redesigning the entire wing." Outside, bomb blasts thudded like a slow heartbeat, the pulse of a dying Reich. At Vogel Air Base in the Netherlands, Wing Commander Roland Beeman ran his Tempest squadrons like clockwork, 3 sorties a day, each 15 minutes from takeoff to touchdown. Beeman called the spring tab system power steering before power steering existed. He ordered ground crews not to discuss the mechanism, even with American allies. Pilots nicknamed the sensation the Tempest touch. At 420 miles per hour, the stick remained light, smooth, responsive, almost telepathic. It allowed them to fight longer, harder, with none of the physical exhaustion that crippled German pilots. By March 1945, RAF records showed 5 Tempest squadrons destroying 188 enemy aircraft for the loss of 19, a kill ratio near 10 to 1. The FW-190D-9, nicknamed Dora, was Germany's last hope. Sleek, powerful, armed with the Jumo 213A engine, but its weakness remained: heavy control forces. At 400 miles per hour, the stick demanded over 80 pounds of force. On March 5, 1945, 2 Dora groups from JG-26 met Tempest over Rhine. The fight lasted 6 minutes at 15,000 feet. 4 Doras were destroyed, 2 damaged. Not a single Tempest was lost. A surviving pilot reported, "The stick would not move. The enemy rolled around us like hawks." The next morning, headquarters issued a new order: do not engage Tempests above 400 kilometers per hour. It was a directive that read like surrender. Back in England, at Hawker's Langley factory, rows of workers, most of them women, checked each spring by hand. Every coil was tightened to exactly 12.3 pounds per inch. They never saw the pilots who depended on them, nor the skies where those tiny parts would decide life and death. The compressed steel within that mechanism could withstand 1 million cycles without fatigue. It meant the difference between a machine that obeyed and a machine that killed its own pilot. Pierre Clostermann wrote in his diary, "After flying the Tempest, no aircraft ever felt heavy again. I could fly 2 hours straight and my arms were still soft." Operation Bodenplatte, January 1, 1945, had been the Luftwaffe's final gamble, a surprise attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries. For a moment it worked, but within days Tempest rose from surviving bases and struck back. In 3 days, 43 German fighters fell. 9 squadrons ceased to exist. Reports to Berlin were grim. "We have lost the sky over Germany." Air warfare had split in 2 philosophies: Germany's pursuit of mechanical perfection, beautiful but fragile; Britain's faith in practical simplicity, ugly but effective. An RAF technician scribbled in his notebook, "We did not beat them with speed, we beat them with control." In March 1945, Focke-Wulf engineers worked around the clock trying to replicate the British system from photographs of crashed Tempests. Only 12 FW-19 0D-12 fighters with makeshift servo tabs were completed before Soviet troops captured the factory at Cottbus. None ever flew combat. At Messerschmitt, another team added hydraulic boost to the Me-2 jet. It worked, but added 180 pounds and reduced range so badly that pilots called it a luxury we can't afford. The Luftwaffe was out of time. A year earlier, such innovation might have changed the war. In 1945, it was a footnote written in smoke. In his January letter home, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Bulligan of JG2 wrote, "We are fighting with yesterday's weapons against tomorrow's technology." Rumors of the Tempest spread through the barracks. They called it the ghost plane, because when they dove to escape at full speed, it followed, always. Fear arrived before the dogfight did. Veterans who had once fought Spitfires now hesitated to engage any large-wing British fighter. The psychological damage was complete, a collapse from inside the cockpit. Technology had broken their will before breaking their machines. April 1945. At Rain Airfield, Tempest crews inspected the wreckage of a downed FW-190. Inside its wing, they found a rough copy of a spring tab, mounted backwards. A desperate experiment that never worked. Clostermann looked at it and said quietly, "They understood it, just too late." By the time Tempest flew north toward Denmark, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Many German pilots burned their own aircraft before the Allies arrived. Not out of defiance, out of shame. The sky was crowded, not with aircraft, but with wreckage. Fields shimmered with burned aluminum, blackened oil, and fragments of human certainty. At 400 miles per hour, the laws of aerodynamics had become a silent executioner, invisible, impartial, and absolute. Every flight now tested how much pain a man could endure before the machine betrayed him. The FW-190's cockpit was a furnace of vibration. Above 370 miles per hour, every movement felt multiplied through resistance. Pilots gritted their teeth as the stick refused to move. One veteran described it, "You wrestled the air until your bones screamed." Instructors warned new recruits, "Never fight the speed. It will kill you before the enemy does." But speed was all that kept them alive. It was a perfect paradox, and it broke them from the inside. Inside that narrow cockpit, sweat froze to the metal. Shoulders cramped, blood drained from the fingers. At the same speed where the British Tempest rolled like silk, the German pilot fought an immovable lever with both arms. It wasn't a duel anymore. It was anatomy versus physics. Every nation had faced this barrier, but only one had solved it. British engineers understood that no amount of training could overcome the aerodynamic load at 400 miles per hour. Human arms were finite, air pressure was not. German test pilot Heinz Baer once said, "We trained our men to fight the wind. The British trained the wind to obey." By February 1945, dozens of Luftwaffe reports repeated the same phrase. Controls locked at high speed. Pilots who tried to dive away found themselves trapped, unable to pull out, unable to roll, watching the horizon tilt until the ground took them. To the engineers at Rechlin, it was a mathematical problem. To the pilots, it was hell. In the laboratories of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, engineers worked behind blackout curtains. They called it the invisible front. Their war wasn't against the Luftwaffe, it was against force. Wind tunnels howled day and night. Brass models of ailerons twisted under compressed air. Gauges twitched as thin springs bent under load. Every reading proved the same truth. Speed was killing control. Yet in those same numbers lay a strange hope, that a simple spring could restore balance. When Captain Eric Brown tested the Tempest prototype in 1944, he described it as power steering before cars had power steering. At 420 miles per hour, the stick moved as if connected to his thoughts. He knew instantly that it wasn't just another fighter. It was the first aircraft designed for the limits of the human body, At Messerschmitt's Augsburg plant, engineers were still drawing new tabs, new servos, new dreams, as the factory roof burned. They had the formulas, the intelligence reports, even captured photos of spring tabs. But nothing left the drawing board. No aluminum, no precision steel, no workers. In April 1945, Dr. Friedrich Zimmermann noted bitterly in his diary, "We have discovered the cure, but the patient is already dead." For the men who had built the Luftwaffe's wings, that was the deepest hell of all, to watch their science outpaced by an enemy who built less, but thought differently. In combat, physics became cruelty. Pilots came home with forearms swollen, ligaments torn. Some couldn't open their hands after landing. Ground crews massaged numb fingers while medics taped wrists. No manual had ever prepared them for the pain of simply steering their machines. Tempest pilots, by contrast, could fly 3 missions a day. Their flight logs read like an accountant's ledger of destruction, precise, efficient, unrelenting. RAF wing reports from February to April 1945 show 239 German aircraft destroyed for only 20 Tempest losses. The numbers tell the story better than propaganda ever could. Technology had become the most efficient killer of all. Somewhere outside Bremen, Oberfeldwebel Hans Keller wrote home, "I no longer fear the flak or the fuel shortage. I fear the sky itself. It grows heavier every day." He never returned from his next mission. His last radio call, "Stick frozen. Cannot roll. Scheisse." Static followed. His wreckage was found weeks later, a crumpled spiral of steel beside a plowed field. The enemy never fired a shot. He had fought the atmosphere and lost. That was the silent horror of 1945. Most pilots didn't die in dogfights. They died inside their own machines. At Volkel, the RAF mechanics called the Tempest the beast that obeys. Every lever, every spring, every bolt was tuned to human proportion. A pilot could fly it with fingertips at 420 miles per hour, something no other fighter could do. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann recalled, "At high speed, I could lift one finger and the aircraft would respond." When his wingman, David Fairbanks, was asked how it felt, he said only, "Like the air had surrendered." The Tempest had become more than a machine. It was an extension of instinct. That was its deadliest feature. It erased the barrier between thought and motion. April 20th, 1945. Jagdgeschwader 26, Northern Germany. 2 FW-190 spotted Tempests diving from the sun. The German leader ordered a split S escape. As they rolled inverted, their sticks jammed halfway. The Tempest followed through effortlessly. Seconds later, 2 columns of black smoke rose over the fields near Lübeck. On the Tempest gun camera, the film ends with a strange image. A German fighter still flying straight, level, powerless. The pilot frozen, arms locked around an unmovable control stick. No enemy ever looked more human than in that frame. After the war, Allied engineers examined captured German fighters. At Wright Field in the United States, test pilots struggled to roll a Bf-109G at full speed. They measured 65 pounds of lateral stick force, nearly 3 times the Tempest. Captain Eric Brown summarized the findings in one line. At maximum velocity, the German aircraft might as well have no ailerons at all. It was not mockery, it was an epitaph. Every nation in war glorifies strength, until it learns that precision wins longer than power. For those who built and flew the Tempest, hell had a different shape. It wasn't fear of dying, it was knowing how easily they could kill. Clostermann confessed years later, "We felt like executioners. They couldn't move. They just fell." The gun cameras recorded each moment with clinical detachment. Crosshairs steady, wings shuddering, a flash, then silence. There was no triumph, only numbness. Inside those cockpits, surrounded by dials and wind, even victory felt mechanical. When machines surpassed their masters, Emotion has no room left to exist. In the ruins of Dessau, former Luftwaffe engineers surrendered their documents to Allied officers. Among them were diagrams of spring tab prototypes, some nearly identical to British versions. The Allies didn't punish them, they hired them. Within 5 years, German and British engineers were working side by side on civilian aircraft. What had been a weapon now became safety. Every airliner born after 1946 carried their legacy: balanced controls, reduced pilot fatigue, reliable feel. Hell had turned into progress. It was perhaps the only redemption technology could offer. In official histories, the spring tab barely earned a paragraph. Radar, jets, and rockets took the glory. But among those who understood aerodynamics, its importance was undeniable. A device that weighed less than 5 pounds had decided hundreds of lives and rewritten the limits of flight. It was the first step toward modern flight control systems, the beginning of humanity's negotiation with speed itself. At its heart was a simple truth: the more we push the air, the more it pushes back. And only by respecting that resistance can we truly fly. After the surrender, survivors from both sides met in captivity. One British pilot shared tea with a German counterpart who had fought over Rhine. The German asked, "What magic did your wings have?" The Briton replied, "Just springs." The German stared, silent for a long time, then said, "Then it wasn't us who lost the war. It was the way we thought." For a moment, both men understood that the hell they shared had not been born of hatred, but of physics and pride. The war was ending not with thunder, but with echo. Factories smoldered under a gray sky. Rail lines cut across the plains like scars. Above them, the last tempests of RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force swept in low formation, their engines tuned, their missions routine. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but the air was already silent. By the final weeks, German pilots no longer believed in victory. They flew because the orders said to, because surrender felt worse than death. At dispersal fields near Lübeck, the ground crews stripped oxygen bottles to sell as scrap. Fuel drums were half buried in mud. Ammunition trucks never arrived. When a tempest appeared overhead, most pilots didn't climb to meet it. They watched, powerless, as it rolled through the clouds, a reminder that the air itself now belonged to someone else. Dr. Gerhard Mayer of Rechlin wrote in his notebook, "A spring of steel has undone the sky of Germany." In the cellars of Dessau, Dr. Friedrich Zimmermann packed the last of his technical files into crates marked spare parts. Blueprints of the spring tab copies lay among them. He had tried to convince Berlin that the redesign was possible. The answer returned. No aluminum, no time, no point. Weeks later, Allied investigators opened those boxes at Farnborough. One British engineer smiled faintly at the drawings and said, "They finally understood. 10 months too late." In that quiet exchange lay the difference between defeat and comprehension. April 27, 1945. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont led 12 Tempests against a train near Lübeck. They dived, fired, climbed, and turned back toward the channel without meeting opposition. When they landed, Beaumont removed his helmet and said to his ground crew, "No more worth shooting at." 2 weeks later, Germany capitulated. At Völkel, pilots raised white cloth on the barrels of their Hispano cannons. The machines that once tore the air at 400 miles per hour now sat motionless, dripping oil into the grass. The war in Europe was finished, and so was the age of the muscle-driven pilot. For those who survived, victory felt strangely hollow. Pierre Clostermann wrote in The Big Show, "We saw no triumph in it, only the quiet of an empty sky and wings dusted with ash." He remembered chasing a FW-190 until it disintegrated midair. The German pilot never fired back. He simply could not move. "I realized then," Clostermann wrote, "we had not won by flying better. We had won because they couldn't move their hands." It was the most merciless kind of progress, one that replaced courage with engineering. Summer 1945. At Farnborough Air Establishment, engineers lined up captured German aircraft for testing. BF-109G, FW-190D, ME-262. Captain Eric Brown flew them all. His report was clinical: FW-190D, 65-pound lateral force at 400 miles per hour. Tempest V, 18 pounds at identical speed. Then he added a single line that became legend. At maximum speed, the German aircraft might as well have no ailerons. Those words were not triumphal. They were a eulogy for every pilot who had tried to fight the air itself. When Allied soldiers entered Focke-Wulf Bremen, they found half-finished wings stacked like tombstones. On the trailing edges, engineers had scrawled in chalk, Versuch Tab 2, nicht gut. Not good. Beside them lay twisted springs that had never been calibrated. Meanwhile, in England, the Hawker Langley plant continued operating until May 8th, not to build weapons, but to test the compression of every remaining spring tab for post-war research. For the women on that line, victory meant measuring tension, not taking lives. Sometimes the smallest instrument decides the longest war. When the newspapers wrote about victory, they mentioned radar, rockets, and jets. No headline spoke of the spring tab. It had no explosions, no heroes, no spectacle. Yet inside technical circles, it was hailed as the quiet revolution. At Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers wrote in a memo, "The spring tab principle shall remain standard until powered assistance becomes universal." That prediction would hold true for 2 decades. Every jet and transport aircraft that followed carried its DNA. German engineering had never lacked brilliance. It lacked humility. The Reich's designers chased the impossible, jets, rockets, and swept wings, but ignored the simple fix that could have saved thousands. A Hawker engineer later reflected, "They built cathedrals to technology. We built a door that opened." Sometimes simplicity wins not because it is clever, but because it arrives on time. By 1947, Soviet designers at Yakovlev Design Bureau examined Allied documents on control force reduction. They wrote, "A simple solution to a problem we have complicated for 5 years." Soon the Yak-9U and MiG-15 incorporated spring tab derivatives. France and Italy adopted similar systems. Japan studied them for the JASDF's first jets. From that lineage grew every modern, field-compensating mechanism in aviation. What had begun as a wartime improvisation became the foundation of post-war flight safety. By 1950, only a few Tempests still flew. Their paint dulled, their engines tired, yet their controls remained smooth as ever. Veterans who revisited them said, "That aircraft taught us humility. It gave us strength without illusion." One serial V778, Pierre Clostermann's Tempest V, survives at the RAF Museum, Hendon. Look closely at the trailing edge of its wing, and the faint weld of the spring tab still glints under the lights. There is no plaque, no fanfare, just metal that once decided the fate of men. The legacy of the spring tab is not about mechanics, it is about boundaries, where human endurance ends and innovation begins. Every leap in speed forces a negotiation with weakness. The Tempest designers accepted that the body would fail and built compassion into steel. From that insight came a century of safer flight. In its quiet way, the spring tab humanized technology, a machine that helped man remain master of the motion he created. In 1961, at an aviation conference in Paris, Eric Brown was asked to name the greatest invention of World War II. Everyone expected him to say jet engine or radar. He lifted a small metal plate from the table instead. "This," he said, "the spring tab." Because it proved that victory doesn't always come from power, but from understanding. The room fell silent. Just as the skies had in 1945, when the last engines of the Luftwaffe faded beyond hearing, and the world finally learned to listen to physics. Today, airliners cross continents at 500 miles per hour. Every pilot's hand rests on a stick connected to sensors, computers, and servo tabs, all descendants of that tiny wartime device. No one remembers Leslie Fries or Sidney Cam. Few know the women at Langley who measured spring tension by eye. But each smooth roll of a modern jet is a quiet memorial to them all. The war ended. The springs kept moving, not for destruction, for balance. And in that balance lies the truest victory of human flight.